Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me and making it possible to join virtually. I'm very honored to talk at the Institute of Development Studies in Kolkata, and I also want to thank Jiban, who made me aware of this conference. We are also very grateful to have him on the Re3Data editorial team, where he has been a very valuable member for many years. Today, I want to talk to you, I want to invite you to reflect with me on the landscape of research data repositories in India and on some results from a study on quality assurance we have conducted in Re3Data Co-Ref. And I want to end with a discussion on some remaining challenges that might provide some barriers to fully realizing research data quality assurance in India. So I want to briefly start with a quick definition of research data repositories. They are basically just specialized infrastructures that focus on the collection, curation, preservation, and dissemination of research data. So they provide specialized services that cater to research data from their creation to eventually publishing or preserving them. Their specific objectives depend on the missions they have. They can look very differently depending on what main goals they want to achieve. But generally, they share some objectives. For example, that they support participation in scholarly communication. They enable open science practices like data publication, and they can contribute significantly to maintaining data quality. And I will give some examples of that later. As Jiban already mentioned, I am affiliated with a project that serves the service Re3Data, a registry that currently lists more than 3,000 research data repositories. And in this brief introduction, I want to quickly show you how Indian research data repositories are reflected there. So on this graph, I have plotted the number of research data repositories associated with Indian institutions that are indexed in Re3Data over time. So here you can see that the number of Indian research data repositories has grown from 1 in 2012 to 51 in 2022. And that is quite a significant increase. It's also quite high. The number is quite high compared to other Asian and BRICS countries, as authors from papers have noted. And I think that's quite noteworthy as well. Most of these Indian research data repositories are discipline specific, so they serve a specific discipline and try to adapt their services to cater to specific needs from that discipline. In comparison, there are fewer institutional repositories in Re3Data. And we think that might be a reflection of indexing practices in Re3Data as well. So at Re3Data, we have the suspicion that we do not cover all Indian research data repositories at the moment, but we are very interested to increase that number if we have any blind spots or if we missed anything. So we are very open to collaborating on covering the Indian research data repository landscape more comprehensively. Because when I looked at the literature, I found that actually institutional repositories are quite common among top-ranked higher education institutions in India. And I also found in the literature the notion that some libraries really have expressed the intention to set up repositories in the next years. So it is questionable if Re3Data has some gaps there, which I'm assuming. So here's an example I want to highlight. This is So I quickly want to show you how Re3 data works. As Jiba noted, Re3 data is a registry that provides detailed, curated, and machine-readable descriptions of research data repositories. And here I picked the ICSSR data service because I found it fitting. I think the ICSSR is the sponsor of today's conference, so I wanted to highlight that. And you can see on one side of the screen the entry of the repository in Re3 data. You can see that Re3 data captures the name and the URL of the repository. It assigns subjects and provides a description. And there's much more information on this repository in Re3 data that you are free to reuse. Re3 data has an open API and uses open licenses, so anyone is free to use that information for any purpose they choose. And on the other side, you can see a screenshot I took from the repository a couple of days ago. And yeah, you can see how Re3 data tries to translate the information on the repository website into Re3 data. In the literature I read prior to this talk, I also found the notion that Indian research data repositories often bridge language barriers for data providers because they tend to have user interfaces in multiple languages. So for example, local languages and English, and thereby they help Indian researchers expose their work, their valuable contributions to research to a wider audience, while also offering services in local languages as well. So I think that is a very valuable contribution of Indian research data repositories. And from the graph I plotted here, you can also see that Indian research data repositories are quite well situated in terms of international collaborations. Here I plotted international collaborations on operating research data repositories that involve Indian institutions. You can see the Indian institutions are at the center of this graph, and then you can see countries they collaborate with. And there's a large number of countries that are in this collaboration network. Most commonly are collaborations with institutions from the USA, but you can see a whole lot of different countries that are in this network. And I also want to note that a fact that I found very interesting is that this comprehensive network of research data repositories has formed despite relative low expenditure in research and development in India. For example, in 2018, India spent 0.66% of its GDP on research and development compared to the global average of 2.2%. So for me, this might be interpreted as an indication that Indian research data repositories use limited resources very efficiently. And I think there might also be a special focus on providing research data repository services there as well. Now I want to move on to the topic of data quality assurance. Data quality and data quality assurance are a bit difficult to define, and I can explain to you why. Basically, data quality assurance encompasses all measures that assess data sets and make sure that they can be used for a specific purpose. And because that purpose can vary depending on what you want to do with data, high quality data, or what constitutes high quality data, it depends on that specific purpose. And that means that data quality is context dependent. So what data quality means in mathematics, for example, might be very different to what data quality means in statistics even, or social sciences. So I think depending on what you want to do with data, they have to meet certain criteria. And that context dependentness is what makes data quality so difficult to define. But I think it's also a chance to reflect more on what you really want to achieve with data. So in 2020, at the project Re3 Data CoRef, we conducted a survey among operators of research data repositories that were indexed in Re3 data. And this research is related to the dissertation of my colleague Maxi Kindling, and we have published an article on that research and the research data as well. And we got a response from, or a complete response from 332 operators of research data repositories. Unfortunately, we did not have any participants from India because I would really have loved to show you a subset of Indian repositories today, but unfortunately, I'm not able to do so. So I'm going to try to get other sources to get an estimate later on. So what you can see here, this Venn diagram shows two types of quality assurance we have worked with in this survey. We have, as is common in the literature, divided data quality assurance into two types. There is formal assessment, which means evaluating more technical or formal aspects of data sets. And then there is data review, which refers to the evaluation of more in-depth scientific quality of data sets. And looking at the results from our survey, we found that 22.9% of the respondents perform neither type of quality assurance. So about a fifth of the respondents say they do not perform data quality assurance at all. But the majority of repositories we asked perform at least one of these measures, sometimes both. And overall, it is quite common for repositories to do both formal assessment and review of data. And between the two types, we can see that data review is a little less common. 51.5% of participants state that they perform data review, whereas 62.3% said that they performed formal assessment. In the survey, we then moved on to specific measures for ensuring data quality. Here, for example, we asked who is responsible for the assessment and curation according to formal criteria. So this refers to formal assessment. And generally, we found that repositories' approaches to quality assurance are very diverse. This really has a lot to do with the scope of the repository and its mission. But we found that here, the areas where repository operators see the responsibility mainly with the repository and not so much with the data depositor are metadata generation in general, ensuring the consistent application of the metadata schema, and taking care of the physical integrity of the dataset. So repository operators see their role in quality assurance mainly in these areas. Other quality assurance measures are often shared with data depositors, but here the focus is clearly on the repository. We also looked at criteria for data review, so this more in-depth review of the scientific quality of data. And we found that here as well, criteria related to metadata are very important. They rank at the top, several of them. So metadata really is very important to ensuring data quality assurance. And here we also found that many repositories find it very important to check if data are suitable to the scope of the repository, and they consider that a part of quality assurance as well. So as I told you before, unfortunately, we did not have any participants from India in our survey, but I tried to find some estimate of how widespread data quality assurance is in India, and I found a survey among 18 Indian institutional repositories that asked similar questions. And I want to compare these numbers a bit here. So this survey is quite limited in scope, but I think it might still give an indication. So we don't have to trust this a lot and put a lot of weight on this. But I think as an indication, this can be very useful. So this survey found that 44% of the Indian institutional repositories perform formal assessment. And that is quite similar to the global survey we performed, in which 62.3% of the participants performed formal assessment. However, the percentage is quite a bit lower for data review. Here, Indian repositories are not as active as the global repository landscape, I would say. So there might be some potential for increase of services here. And looking at specific quality assurance measures these Indian institutional repositories perform, you can see that all of them assign metadata, which was rated very important in terms of ensuring data quality assurance, ensuring data quality. And 55.6% appraise data before ingest. So here they make sure that data fit in the scope of the repository. Less common are the provision of in-depth documentation of data. So for example, this means documenting variables or providing README files. And only 22.2% of the repositories asked perform rights management. And I think that is an important area where a lot more activity could be beneficial. That leads me to the last part where I want to discuss some remaining challenges. And this again is largely based on literature. So I personally don't have much insight into the Indian landscape of research data repositories. That's why I'm very grateful that Jiban has agreed to join me on writing the final paper for this talk, because I think he will be able to provide the perspective from an Indian researcher on this. So I think we then will be able to give this more context. So what I found when reading the literature is that one challenge that still remains is that there are currently few research data policies at Indian higher education institutions. And that is important because having a data policy demonstrates the commitment of an institution to provide sustainable infrastructures for research data and to research data management. So if an institution gives itself a data policy that truly shows commitment, and then many stakeholders can see what the strategy or the long-term perspective on research data management is supposed to be. So I think that is an area where some challenges still remain. Another area is the training of repository staff. So of course, repository staff has to be needs to be very skilled because it's complex work. And many sources I read state that Indian library workers are well positioned to facilitate research data management at their institutions. And that is because librarians or library workers have a lot of experience with managing digital information objects already. So that is a great resource to use, I think, although some training might still be required. Because that is also what librarians said when they were asked. They asked for more training and for the adaptation of curricula of library and information science programs at universities. And I think that can be very fruitful in the long term, but it might take some years to see the effect of these measures. But I think it would be very useful to provide specialized training for library workers. And the last challenge I identified in the literature was the establishment of research data management services. As it stands, not all repositories offer consultation services or technical services. And if they do offer these services, consultations are often centered about enabling data reuse and not so much on publishing data, for example. And the technical services tend to be focused on operating a repository and on long-term preservation. And what I'm missing from this is the centering data quality assurance into these repository services. So if Indian research data repositories want to build capacity for data quality assurance, I think a great way to start would be to look at the service portfolio and maybe expand it in terms of offering consulting services that do cover aspects of data quality. And another thing I would also like to highlight here is that the use of persistent identifiers and open licenses are also really, really important to ensure data quality and for other aspects as well. I think Jiban might talk about this a little more in his talk on fairness and research data repositories later. So in conclusion, I would like to say that it is apparent that India has been quite consistent and an early adopter of research data repositories because the network that has formed has started from years ago and it has continually grown over the years. And these repositories fill a very important role because they are able to bridge language barriers and they foster participation in scholarly communication. And I think that is a very important task. Yeah, it is also noteworthy that research data repositories in India perform data quality assurance at similar rates compared to the global repository landscape, except for the in-depth review of the scientific value of dataset, which might still need some work. However, that's a very difficult task, and I think we have to acknowledge that, and it will not come from nothing. So this might take some time. And overall, some challenges to establishing data quality assurance remain. But I think the Indian research data repository landscape is overall very well equipped to deal with these challenges. And I'm really confident that this will only continue to improve over the years. I want to thank you again for inviting me today and making it possible that I can join virtually, if only briefly. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.